infusion and why? The need and what's the whole concept behind infusion?
Right. The term infusion is one that implies a change in the content that is being taught in the regular curriculum of the school. And that's to be contrasted, for example, with special courses, which also need to be taught.
Okay.
You know, there need to be African Studies courses. But the infusion says that whatever is taught ought to take into account the reality of the experience of African people. And if you don't do that, then you have a distorted picture of the reality of both African people and European people and all other people.
Right.
Since African people have been intimately involved in the development of human civilization since the beginning of time up to the present. The problem that we have right now that demands that this be a priority is, and this is the part that's hard for people to understand, is that there has been, over the past 400 years, and especially over the last 200 years in particular, a systematic process to defame African people.
Right.
See, in other words, we don't have neutral history or neutral science or neutral art. We have an art and a science that was used in all of those academic disciplines to distort the image of African. Psychologists said we had no minds. Theologians said we had no souls. Historians said we had no history. Artists said we were primitive.
Okay.
So no matter what academic discipline you're talking about, the picture that was drawn of the African was one that would justify the slave trade or colonization, and then later that would make racism supported, that would support racism. So we have a unique situation with respect to African people in that we have that many years of propaganda directed against us that has not been purged from the images and from the literature. And so part of the infusion process is to counter the propaganda and the teachings of white supremacy, which still abound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What have been some of the obstacles to this infusion that you see getting it?
One of the biggest obstacles is ignorance.
Okay.
And as quiet as it's kept, it's ignorance of academics in the field where they work. In other words, very few academics know their field in ethnic terms. You know, they don't know the role. For example, very few physicists know the role that African people played in the development of physics. Very few, and it was a major role, and very few people who are historians in their own learning were taught that African people had any part to play in history. So when you get started and you start saying there's something meaningful and non-trivial, one of the obstacles is that the academic is so ignorant of the discipline on this topic that they feel that it's a phony issue.
Okay.
That is that you're really asking me to get involved in something.
That it's been perpetuated.
And for example,
so long.
you get a person who I think Schlesinger is the guy who calls it academic cheerleading. Well, there's no evidence that I have anywhere that he's ever studied anything in depth about African people. And so to comment about something that you don't know anything about, is a revelation of ignorance to start with. And so that's one of the reasons that we had this conference, is to tap the tip of the iceberg and put before people. See, we didn't come in and say, here is your curriculum. We said, here is something of the vast knowledge base that we could operate from. And so I think that the uniform comment of most conferees that I talked to, their minds were blown. They had no idea that we had that much information. And what's so important about it is that we have more than that. In other words, we didn't even begin to get into the information that we do have. So that's a major obstacle, is that people don't know what there is to be known, and they don't know what they don't know.
You know? And they're rejecting it based on ignorance.
They make categorical rejections in ignorance. That's one of the first things. A second obstacle has to do with the fact that there's a small kind of a right-wing conservative group that still knows why history was fabricated in the first place. And so they still want to do that. And they don't come out front and say that. And so they code their response and appear to be on the side of the angels, but in fact do not want African people or any other people to know the truth about the contributions of African people in the world. And we have many examples of this, especially in certain areas that specifically the ancient history of African people. There's a literal fear that we will discover the truth about that ancient history among this small subset of people. And there's also that same kind of concern with respect to having a picture of ourselves, for example, in resistance movements in history, like to really know in depth what happened in Haiti. And most people know there was a Haiti, have no knowledge. If the word comes up, all you know is Papa Doc and Baby Doc. But there's a little more to the story than that. And so the fact that there is this, that some people have an agenda that they're not expressing overtly, that's an obstacle. You see.
I was excited with the Haitians, not cutting you off, but in New York, they had the Haitians close the city. When the FDA had the thing about Haitians have the high rate of AIDS. I had never seen such a coming together of a culture. They made. I was excited. So we're looking at the function and goals were basically to lay a foundation then. For the knowledge. More or less preparing people to.
Exactly. See, I have a faith that if people have the information that they need, that the specific design, what will you teach on Tuesday, that's less important than the knowledge that there's something to teach on Tuesday. And so there are going to be certain kind of professional judgments, and we do get into some of that, illustrating how you can take this basic information, turn it into curriculum materials. For example, we had some demonstrations, Abner Walker, other people, early childhood. What would an early childhood person do with this kind of information? How would you use the pictures, the maps, the charts, the graph? That's a second level of operation. And so I think Wade Nobles is the one that talked last year in his keynote address about infusion is both a matter of content and intent. It's a matter of content because you have to have accurate and meaningful, non-trivial information that you're trying to engage the student in dialogue about. It's also a matter of intent because that really addresses the question of where you stand on the question of equity in the society. And so if your intent is democratic, then your use of content will be appropriate. But if your intent is undemocratic, as if you are racist, if you believe in the priority of one group over another, either consciously or unconsciously, then that intent will be reflected in the use of content.
And a lot of the studies, that the things everybody the pictures that we see are always our temples and tombs and what have you. And I get my question now is, what do you suggest as far as people who are trying to give kids a sense of understanding, but also making them understand that everybody cannot be a king or a queen. We need everybody, and that part of the history is not being presented as much. And
I'm glad you brought that up because your point is extremely well taken. And I hear that all the time. We used to be kings and queens. Well, everybody wasn't a king and a queen. In fact, most people were not kings and queens. But there was someone from our group. In other words, I think what they're trying to say is that that African people had the same kind of structure nationally that everybody else had. Which means that there would be influential leadership, influential internally and influential externally. And so we had people just like the Europeans have kings and so forth. Africans had kings, and in fact we had incredible kings and queens. And it is true that we are the descendants of the people who had that. But at the same time, we should never lose sight of the fact that the common people are just as important as the kings and queens. And so for that reason, what I like to emphasize more than the kings and queens is the culture that is carried by the people. So my emphasis is on people history. You know, what kinds of creativities have African people had that influenced the world civilization, that also characterize and describe, you know, African people. So that's an important thing, that we cannot simply rest on that issue. But another thing that needs to be said about that is that the reason people say that frequently is that they have to fight back.
Right. Okay.
And it's because kings and queens of Europe are being thrown at us. You see, and so what people are saying back is, well, we had those too, you know, which is true that we did, and especially, and it's not just that kings and queens of Europe are thrown at us, but when you get historians like Toynbee who say that Africans never created a nation, or Hume, you know, or many of the other influential European writers who swore up and down African people were savages and pagans and they didn't do anything, then you have to just simply assert your humanity by appeal to the empirical historical record. And so for that reason, like, I have a set of photographs of kings and queens of ancient Egypt, and they are kings and queens of ancient Egypt, especially in the pyramid dynasties and in the literary and literary age, which would be the Middle Kingdom, where all incredible numbers of books of highly sophisticated development were in process, were in play, and the imperial period, which would be the New Kingdom. And so I decided that I just needed to show the pictures of who the kings and queens were during the most important developmental period. They're all black, not some, all. I mean, your eyes tell you that. And so we have to get that out of the way, because people have tried to deny that that has anything to do with African people, you know. And so that's why people get into this stupid argument about, you know, whether we were kings and queens. Of course we were kings and queens, but we were also across the board, you know, common people. And what's really most beautiful about African people to me is the culture that's shared by all the people, royal and common, and not merely the fact that we were kings and queens.
There